On October 25, 1950, the silent fears of the United Nations were confirmed. The Chinese that had been quietly amassing between the UN forces and the Yalu River suddenly made their presence known. In the Central Mountains, thousands of American troops were ambushed and surrounded by a massive Chinese division. Entire battalions were caught off guard and decimated. Airdrops were all the support the UN soldiers had. They fought desperately in all directions, trying to make it out alive. Most of them didn't. As word of the massacre spread among the troops, their morale, which had been sky high just hours before, dropped quickly.
They said it sounded like Chinese. No one knew what the hell was going on. It was Halloween and colder than a witch. We waited and froze. It was very dark. Robert Harper, 19th Infantry.
The Far East Command, already gearing up for a victory parade, still couldn't believe it was facing a full Chinese assault. Reports back to Washington claimed the attacks came from a small force assisting with the defense of the Yalu River, and nothing more. But General Walker was alarmed. He ordered all of his units, even those far from the attack, to pull back to the Changchun River and reevaluate the situation. Then, just as abruptly as the ambushes came, they ended. The Chinese faded back into the hills and waited. Throughout November, American surveillance planes tried to determine just how many Chinese were out there. Estimates counted between 50 and 70,000, a manageable number. But it turned out they missed another 250,000. The Chinese were incredibly adept at concealing themselves. They would keep still all day, camouflaged under helmets covered with brush. To planes flying overhead, heavily occupied areas often looked like empty landscape. Most of November passed quietly, and UN troops held out hope that they'd make it home for Christmas. Assured by the silence, General MacArthur ordered a cautious advance on November 24th. In the west, the 8th Army would head for the Yalu as a unified front, hoping to prevent any single battalion from being caught out on a limb. In the east, the 10th Corps was ordered to make a major advance around the Chosun Reservoir. The first day of the offensive was encouraging. Modest gains were made all along the line. But then, on November 25th, the war suddenly turned upside down. The Chinese found a vulnerable gap between the 8th Army and the 10th Corps in the Central Mountains. They struck there with all their might. The entire UN line was split in two. 3 days into a renewed offensive, the UN force found itself in a full-scale retreat. The UN's lines, as well as its spirits, were broken. And with the attack came the North Korean winter, an enemy that would prove every bit as merciless as the communists. By late November of 1950, United Nations forces were fighting for their lives. The police action that was supposed to produce fast results and total victory had managed to lure opposition from the world's most populous adversary, China. As the front to its west was crumbling, the 10th Corps faced a mounting challenge along the Chosun Reservoir. The Chosun lay high in North Korean mountain country. By late November, the cold there was blistering. The temperature fell as low as 40 below zero, and 50-mile-an-hour winds made it feel even colder. Everything the troops touched turned to ice: engine oil, gun breeches, morphine, and even their own hands and feet. The ground was so frozen that digging a foxhole was out of the question. One pastime to keep the blood flowing was a friendly snowball fight. This was certainly not the ideal place to spend Thanksgiving, but the troops made the best of it.
For Thanksgiving, we were all served turkey and all the things that go with it. You had to eat fast because everything was turning cold. The gravy and then the mashed potatoes froze first. Boy, you ate fast. And all the time the snipers were shooting at us. William Davis, hospitalman.
Siberian weather and enemy insurgents had taken their toll on the troops. The men had worn the same clothes for weeks, and good meals were few and far between. Troops hardly slept in the sub-zero cold. But in true Marine fashion, they pulled themselves together and prepared to mount an offensive on November 27th. The soldiers were bracing for the worst, having heard the reports of Chinese overwhelming units to the west. The objective was to move around the western side of the Chosun and head north toward Kangye, where the North Korean government was hiding. UN troops were concentrated in 4 positions. The front line lay at Udamni, where Marine regiments were preparing to lead the charge. South of there, 3,000 U.S. Marines were stationed at the base of the reservoir. Down at Koto-ri were 4,200 men, including some Army infantry and British Marines. On the east side of the reservoir stood another 2,500 GIs. Supply lines to these troops were in severe jeopardy, since units below them were already retreating to ports along the coast. But they were ordered to press on alone. To keep the supplies coming, they relied on one of the newest machines of war, the helicopter. Choppers first appeared in World War II, but improvements to their design and stability made them indispensable in Korea, especially during that Arctic winter when ground transport was next to impossible. On the western shore of the Chosin, the Marines crept forward from Udamni and found a solid wall of Chinese waiting for them. Immediately, strategy shifted from offense to defense, and the regiment fell back to the village to brace for an attack. It wasn't long in coming. On November 28, 1950, 6 Chinese divisions descended on Udamni. For 3 days, the battle raged. The Marines unleashed their entire arsenal on the Communists. The Marine Air Wing flew bombing runs from carriers out in the Sea of Japan. But it wasn't enough. The Chinese had been surrounded. If these men were going to make it out alive, they would have to fight every step of the way. Their commander, Oliver P. Smith, offered some famous words of encouragement. "Gentlemen, we are not retreating. We are merely attacking in another direction." Across the Chosun to the east, an even greater disaster was unfolding. The Army 7th Division was cut off on a 4,000-foot plateau, surrounded and vulnerable. Anywhere it turned, it would face a vicious fight. Some soldiers went AWOL, off into the hills or onto the ice of the reservoir, hoping to escape the trap. A special task force was created to bore a hole through the Chinese and back to friendly lines. Task Force Faith took only enough trucks to carry the wounded and destroyed all the weapons it couldn't carry. It set out on December 1st. Enemy fire came from all sides. As if this wasn't enough to contend with, friendly napalm fell a little too close for comfort. The two lead companies were shelled by planes flying close air support. The task force came upon a village swarming with communists and was completely blocked. There was no option but to advance directly through the Chinese blockade. 2,500 GIs entered the town. Only 1,000 made it through. Those that could dragged their fallen buddies with them. After 13 days of hell, Task Force Faith finally made it to safe ground. The campaign along the frozen Chosin has become legendary in modern war history. Rarely, if ever, was the cold more blistering, the enemy more unmerciful, or the escape more precarious. And the men who served there are joined forever in a brotherhood known as the Chosen Few. General MacArthur watched from a distance as his forces crumbled in November 1950. Korea would be his final crusade, and a resounding victory there would have assured his immortality. But that victory, imminent just days ago, was slipping away. His frustration was immeasurable, and most of it was directed at the Truman administration. Truman had limited MacArthur's resources to prevent him from attacking China. He imposed airspace restrictions that forbade U.S. fighters from chasing Chinese planes beyond the Korean border, and he limited the amount of manpower and equipment that was sent to the front. MacArthur found these restraints crippling. On November 28th, he sent a message of warning to the Pentagon. "We face an entirely new war. Our present strength of force is not sufficient to meet this undeclared war by the Chinese. This command has done everything humanly possible within its capabilities, but now is faced with conditions beyond its control and its strength. General MacArthur." The relationship between the president and his general, never entirely cooperative, was disintegrating as quickly as the UN's field position. Like its advance 2 months earlier, the UN's retreat gathered momentum as it went. The mass exodus of soldiers was eclipsed only by that of petrified North Korean civilians. Thousands were eager to defect. Their restlessness may have been inspired by UN-sponsored leaflets like these that were airdropped over North Korean villages. The leaflets warned of the dangers of communism and touted the freedom of Western ideals. Disgruntled with their treatment in North Korea, thousands fled south. Meanwhile, the Chinese charge continued. As Christmas approached, UN morale was desperately low. The men resented the limitations being imposed by Washington. Their complaint, which would be echoed 15 years later in another Asian conflict, was that they weren't being allowed to use their superior force to win the war. They, like their general, thought that if they only had better support, they could have spent Christmas in Kalamazoo instead of Korea. To make matters worse, 2 days before Christmas, their field commander, General Walker, was killed in a jeep accident. The fearless leader who'd once told his troops, "If I ever see you back here, it had better be in a coffin," would go home in one himself. Walker's successor was Matthew B. Ridgway, a proven leader who understood MacArthur's zest for conquest and Washington's wavering enthusiasm. He'd served in both climates. In World War II, he commanded an airborne division over Italy. Later, he served at the Pentagon. His level-headed wisdom brought a vital balance to the battlefield. When he arrived at the front, Ridgway was startled by the somber mood. He wrote to a colleague, "It was clear to me that our troops had lost confidence. I could read it in their eyes, in their walk. I could read it in the faces of their leaders, from sergeants right on up to the top. There was a complete lack of that alertness, that aggressiveness that you find in troops whose spirits are high." General Ridgway. The Chinese onslaught only added to their misery. By New Year's Eve, the Red Army had crossed the 38th parallel and was closing in on Seoul. Ridgway ordered a retreat back to the Han River, except for an arc around Seoul. There, his troops were clinging to the northern fringes of the city. But they couldn't hold out for long. 7 Chinese armies were stampeding straight for Seoul. And once again, the UN was overwhelmed. On January 3rd, Seoul fell for the second time, and by the next day, the UN line had dropped 35 miles south of the capital, well below the Han River. The troops were almost back to square one. In the 4 months since they'd last been here, all they'd gained were casualties. Luckily, breakthroughs in war medicine were keeping many of those casualties alive.